Good morning, everyone. My name is Heila Lotz Sisitka, and I work at Rhodes University. And I'm going to be presenting to you on climate change education, looking at climate change education from different angles: science, politics, management, ethics, action, and then ask the question, how do we conceptualize climate change education in this, what I would call multi-leveled patchwork environment for climate change education. So climate change, as we know, is a science issue. We wouldn't know about it otherwise. It's a political issue. We wouldn't have so many COPs otherwise. It's a development and management issue. It wouldn't be in the SDGs otherwise. It's an ethical issue. It wouldn't produce so much debate in society if it wasn't. And it's an action issue because of the severity of the risk that we are facing. So in climate change education, then, what do we have? We have what I've called in a previous presentation of something like a patchwork dilemma, where we see a lot of climate change education and it looks kind of patchy because some people are teaching climate science, some teaching people are approaching it from a politics point of view, some are doing climate change as development and management work, some are focusing on the ethics, some are focusing on the action. And we can ask ourselves the question, what should we do as climate change educators? And how do we bring this patchwork into focus and then also perhaps do something to develop it further in order to help guide the way that we do climate change education? So that's what I want to talk about today. I'm going to take us very briefly through each of these and then focus a little bit more onto perhaps the conceptual and emerging conceptual framework for climate change education that we can all draw on and work with as we go forward. So climate change is definitely a science issue. We know the graphs, the hockey stick graphs, people monitoring all of the impacts and implications of carbon dioxide emissions in the atmosphere. Here's a slide from the most recent IPCC report, which is looking at the cumulative emissions of carbon dioxide and future non-carbon dioxide radiative forcing. And what they're trying to do there is to determine the probability of limiting warming to 1.5 degrees. So why I've put this little slide up here is that you can see that what the scientists are doing is they're measuring, but they're also modeling. So this climate change science is a type of science that uses measuring as well as modeling. And the two are not necessarily the same thing. People measure in order to model. So they produce a predictive type of science. And you can see here that some of the measuring that's going on is estimated anthropogenic warming to date and likely range of that, observed monthly global mean surface temperature, measuring and tracking, and then from that projecting. So this is very typical of climate science. And what we see in climate science is a new and highly specialized kind of science with its own technical terms, its own concepts, its own methodologies and tools. For example, the concept of radiative forcing is an important concept in climate change science because it is a measure of the influence a factor has in altering the balance of incoming and outgoing energy in the Earth atmosphere system, and it's an index of the importance of the factor as a potential climate change mechanism. So if you're a climate scientist, you definitely need to know a lot about radiative forcing. We can ask ourselves the question, to what extent is this concept now already introduced into our education system or not? And if not, why not? And at what level do we begin to work with this particular concept if we are thinking about teaching climate science? And then we have to ask, what does it mean and how do we do this kind of work? And then it goes on to say in the IPCC report, it says, in this report, radiative forcing values are for changes relative to pre-industrial conditions defined at 1750 and are expressed in watts per square meter. So you can see there the sort of technical dimension of climate change science and also the time-space configurations. So all of these things are very important in terms of climate change science. And of course, there's much, much more to it than what I can bring to you here today. All I wanted to do is make the point that it's a new, highly specialized kind of science with its own technical terms, concepts, methodologies, and tools. And for example, in this picture at the bottom here, we can see the monitoring, types of monitoring tools that are used in climate change monitoring, networks, and so on. So these are the sorts of things that one would need to do if you're starting to look at climate science, is you'd have to understand this particular type of science with its terms, concepts, methodologies, and tools. What we're also seeing in climate change science is that the scientists are working on applying what they are understanding or coming to understand and making it accessible to the general public. So here we see some graphs where they are showing the what they call the global warming effects, impacts, and or risks associated with what they call reasons for concern in selected dimensions of the natural, managed, and human system. So, for example, you can see here they are looking at the little grey line across the middle is at 1 degree Celsius warming, the kinds of risk that emerge, and they color them in from purple to white, with red and yellow being red being severe and widespread impacts and risks, and yellow indicates that our impacts and risks are detectable and attributable to climate change with at least a median confidence. So you can see that they're saying, if you look at the bottom here, that at 1 degree, the warm water corals are in deep trouble. You can see the purple to red over there. The small scale, low latitude fisheries are also in medium to high risk when we get to 1 degree above current temperatures. So you can then see why we have small scale fishers busy protesting, protect the oceans, because they are at risk, you see. So that's another dimension of this science, is the application to societal concerns and then trying to assist planners to work out how to respond to these risks. A further dimension of the climate science that has been very interesting and important is also the Earth system sciences, looking at the whole Earth system and then trying to establish planetary boundaries, what they call planetary boundaries, which is looking at like overshoot, areas of overshoot where we're having too big an impact for the Earth system to manage its kind of stability, and also it is sort of overreaching in terms of what is considered to be a safe space for human life. And that is in the little green in the center of this first side of the diagram, is what they call the safe operating space for humanity. And then we've got overshoot in terms of biosphere integrity and biochemical flows, you can see. And we're busy overshooting into the orange with climate change and land system change, for example. So this scientific project is going on. It's been going on for quite a long time now, and it is being refined as time goes on. And also new dimensions are coming to bear with and in relation to the science. For example, the partnerships with Kate Raworth's Economics, where they've started to try to articulate better what the safe space for humanity is, and then looking at it both in terms of the basics needed for safe and just societies, such as good education, good health, and so on in the center. And then on the outside, we see the zones of unacceptable environmental dangers. And in the middle, in the green circle, is the safe operating space for humanity. And that, of course, is an economic issue as much as it is anything else. So the geological scientists are also talking about this as a change in epoch, a shift from the Holocene, when humans were able to settle and establish their societies and their economies. And they're saying that we're now facing the Anthropocene, which is an epoch which indicates that humans are actually changing the nature of the Earth system. So there's a lot going on in these sciences. And for educators, it's quite important, if you are doing climate change education, to do have some understanding of the foundational dimensions of climate change science, systems thinking approaches, and understanding these different types of science and the new dimensions of that science, and then also the confluence of, for example, science and economics and what that actually means. So climate change, of course, is also and has become a very important development and management issue, and that's most obviously seen in the nature of the Sustainable Development Goals, which are global development goals agreed on by all of our governments. And there's a whole lot of targets there, and so our governments are trying to manage society, manage climate change in relation to these targets. And all of the governments are having to sign up to this. And so we start to see quite a lot of differentiating of this development and management project. For example, greenhouse gas emissions and how to reduce those. You can see there's targets for that. There's targets for increasing the number of people with capacity for climate adaptation planning. There's targets for reducing carbon emissions from agriculture, and so on and so on. So you can see, a lot of this kind of development planning around mitigation and capacity building and other things, and trying to see where things are possible and better to do compared to other things, and so on and so on. So there's a lot of that kind of work going on. And what we're seeing is that a sort of link up now between science and economics, as I mentioned earlier, with the planetary boundaries and the donut economics concepts, articulating the safe and just space for humanity, and then turning that into development goals. And so we see then the SDGs, and the sort of overarching narrative is that we can meet the needs of all within the means of the planet, but we have to restructure and reorganize our societies quite fundamentally in order to do that. So that's where you see science, economics, and development are starting to meet up much more strongly. And so we get discourses like green economy. We also get a lot of work going on around the concept of a socio-technical transition, which means that we need new technologies that can help us to make the transition to sustainability, to reduce the impacts, the overshoots, and to create this safe space for humanity into the future. So we see groups of scientists working with politicians, working with intergovernmental organizations like the UNFCCC to define a boundary and then to set targets, you see, and then those are then translated into governance tools that societies are supposed to use in order to govern. We're also seeing it being broken down into sectors. So we have the energy sector, the food sector, the transport sector, and then quite a lot of this kind of like development planning around socio-technical transitions and what new technologies we need to generate in order to be able to make the transition towards sustainability, with renewable energy technology probably being the most obvious of these, although there are others emerging in these different sectoral spaces. We also see in the policy discourse new concept of development. So here we see, from the socio-technical transitioning across to what they call climate resilient development pathways. And these are trajectories that strengthen sustainable development at multiple scales and involve efforts to eradicate poverty through equitable societal and systems transitions and transformations, while reducing the threat of climate change through ambitious mitigation, adaptation, and climate resilience. So the focus here, you can see, is on equitable societal and systems transitions and transformations, not just on technical transformations. It's actually bigger than just technical transformations. It's social transformations, societal system transformations that are needed. One of the best cases to study if you really want to understand this, is to look at the food system and the transformations that are occurring within the food system. They're not just socio-technical, they're also socio-cultural, and they have to be systemic. And there's a lot of very interesting work going on there. I won't spend a lot of time on it now. So in a country like South Africa, we can see this little green arrow here is some of the development planning that South Africa has been doing at a policy level in terms of climate change response. So in our National Development Plan, there is a commitment to socio-ecological development to some extent, although it's quite contradictory. Sorry, we also have adaptation planning, we have mitigation planning, we have climate resilient development planning, green economy planning, and now we have SDGs, and now the most recent discourse is just transitions in terms of the national planning to respond to climate change as a risk. Climate change is also not just a policy issue and a management issue, but it's also a social justice and a political issue. And I love this little board. It says, change the politics, not the climate. And of course, we've seen this massive uprising amongst the youth, the young people in our schools around the world and in our communities, asking for giving better attention to climate change as a political issue. And it's an issue that is intergenerational in scope, it's cultural, it requires political change, and it's also temporal, it has temporality. And this particular one little pamphlet here says British imperialism causes climate injustice. And of course that refers to the long durée of history which has produced coloniality, and then of course some of the impacts that impact today in terms of climate change vulnerability. So we've seen young people across the world, also a very interesting indicator that the education system is really not doing what it needs to be doing in terms of climate change education, and young people breaking out of the education system, out of the school system and into the streets in order to ask for education to be more political, and to take up the issues. Kids want climate justice in some serious ways. So here you can see, when you start to study this social movement, you'll see it's really interesting. There's so many dimensions to it. So one of the strong dimensions is the economic hegemony is not working for the majority of people or the planet. And so you start to see people, very strong critiques of capitalism, saying things like there are no jobs on a dead planet. Let's look after the planet so that we can have, clean and decent jobs. Looking at, the problem of chasing profits while the planet burns. What do we put first, profits or people or planet? And that kind of a discussion. We can also see how it plays out in terms of other issues. So here's land for food, not coal. So people are asking for other priorities, other forms of prioritization in terms of policy and politics. And of course, what we also see is that this climate justice movement is very much an intersectional movement, where we have climate justice, women's movements, indigenous peoples' movements, land movements, all coming together in order to put forward the point that the current system is socially very much unjust at the moment, and there's a need to really focus on that. So we can say then, if we're doing work with climate justice in education, that we do need to look at it from an intersectional point of view and from a systemic change point of view. So we want clean air, we want good jobs, we want to resolve issues of racism and immigration, what would you call it, injustices. And we want to look at system change, not just climate change. So it really broadens the focus from the science of climate change to a social justice kind of discourse. And we see that one of the main discourses that have emerged out of this is the discourse of just transitions. And it's a discourse which originally originated in the labor movement. And what we see now, it's been taken up into the policy sphere and was incorporated into the 2015 Paris Agreement as a way of signaling the importance of minimizing negative repercussions from climate policies and maximizing the positive social impacts for workers and communities. And here's a lovely little diagram which shows the human dimensions of the just transition. And it looks at, how to, when we're dealing with climate change, making our socio-technical transitions, how do we do that in a way that is foreground social justice? So for workers, for communities, for consumers, and for citizens. And it really foregrounds the issues of democracy, participation, and impacts on people and people's lives. So that's a very important discourse, very important for South Africa, for Southern Africa, and it is being taken up quite substantively in the national policy sphere. And we see new and different perspectives being articulated around just transitions, and I think we're only really just beginning that work, but some very exciting work emerging around it. And so you can sort of see different the articulations here in different sectors. So high exposure, high carbon sectors. What should we do in terms of workers, communities, consumers, and citizens? with zero carbon green sectors. What should happen there for workers, communities, consumers, and citizens in terms of resilience? What should we do in terms of workers, communities, consumers, and citizens? And this is, of course, very important for environmental education. If we are working within a just transitions framework, we need to consider these dimensions of the transformation and transitioning to a more sustainable world order. So climate change is a political issue, as we've just been discussing, but it's also an ethical issue, and we see more and more discussion on climate change as an ethical issue. I like this picture. Often the ethical discussion seems to, focus in on the individuals, but of course it's also a wider social concern. And I like this little poster here: ethics is always on trend. And what's very interesting is that in times of struggle, ethical discussions come to the fore, as Andrew Sayer has told us quite a few years ago. And what we see with the foregrounding of ethics, the ethics of climate change, is we see quite a lot of material being written by philosophers and theorists to try to consider the way in which climate change is, or to articulate climate change as a moral issue and as an ethical concern. So UNESCO has recently released a declaration of ethical principles in relation to climate change, very recently, only in 2017. And this is quite a big signal in the shift from climate change being seen as a science issue or a political issue or a development issue to an ethical concern. And that, of course, brings in a whole range of different types of activities and practices and ways of doing things. If it's an ethical concern compared to, say, for example, a development concern or a management concern. So there's a lot of work that's emerging there. There's also a history to that work, which is shown in that other little diagram there. And of course, it brings to the fore the issue of solidarity and strengthens up the climate justice dimension as well. So we've seen now, climate change being a science issue, a political issue, a development issue, a ethical issue, and of course with the SDGs, SDG 13, climate change is now being articulated very strongly as an action issue, and there's a lot of emphasis on different types of action that needs to occur in order to resolve the climate dilemma that we have, climate change dilemma. So there's a little picture of, say, in Zambia, one of the major actions there is conservation farming. In Uganda, there's SMS weather warnings going on. There's all sorts of other things, smart dikes and amphibian houses being designed and built. There's all sorts of different ethically inspired climate change actions. There's an emergency cooling center. There's closing of the Great Barrier Reef, and so on and so on. So there's quite a lot of these different moves to climate proof the planet. So it's kind of interesting. And of course, once we start looking, we just see so many different types of climate action. And of course, people are saying climate action now. So there's an urgency to it. There's articulations of why this matters. There's a whole range of different types of climate action that can be done. There's, for example, solar power to the people. So there's divesting and many other kinds of climate action. And I like this. There's even a climate action bingo game that one can play to draw attention to the different climate actions. And one finds many kind of articulations of what climate actions are. And therefore, for education, you can ask, so how do we participate in that? And we see also so much material and literature now on climate action being articulated as an individual choice, family, business, and a community affair. We get all kinds of guidelines, 6 actions to prevent climate change, motivational things. We can solve this together. We must design things different. The climate action challenge is what design can do. How can we change our designs? And so on. Top 5 solutions to climate change. So there's a lot of material on climate action, and we can look around and begin to see, what can we draw from there into our education system. And so it's not only an individual choice or a family or a business and community. Yes, and it's not only an individual or family or community affair. We also see that climate action is a school, college, and university affair. And we've seen a lot of development in projects like, for example, eco schools or green campus projects. UNESCO's got a new book out on climate smart schools, where they look at the school governance system, the curriculum, the community partnerships, as well as the campus management facilities and operations, all working together to be strengthen climate change education in schools. We also see some of our institutions are being fitted with new technologies. The bottom corner here, you can see a picture from Nelson Mandela University, where they've just installed these huge solar panels. And of course, that's a learning space for the students in the university. And then we've also seen quite a lot of work coming through on, the importance of place in climate change education, because the implications and the impacts are so different in different places. So these are some of the things that are coming up as we look at climate action in schools. And again, there's so much experience that we can look at and draw on and develop in our climate change education programs. So we can then ask the question, what role for education, and what is or should climate change education be? And these little 3 little pictures here give us a little bit of a hint. So it says promote climate change awareness through environmental education. So let's bring environmental education into our story. The earth needs thinkers, not deniers. Let's develop critical thinking. Teach the Truth is an interesting little pamphlet at the bottom there. And that relates also, I think, to the denialism. And it's so difficult to always know exactly what the boundaries of good climate science are, especially also because it's so predictive, and therefore it's difficult to know the future. So it's a very interesting kind of challenge for educators, because the epistemology of climate change is complex. It's not just a simple fact. It's actually much more complex than that. But at the same time, we can't say that it's so difficult and therefore not deal with it. So there's a lot that needs to happen in climate change education, also in terms of the capacity of the educators. So here's another little slide which starts to show some more of the dimensions of climate change. There's climate change education. One is climate literacy, educating with the future in mind. So there's a futures dimension. Here's another little picture that says we need to learn new green skills and learn to behave responsibly so that we can stop climate change. So that brings out issues of skills and responsible behavior. There's short, medium, and long-term dynamics to this. There's action-centered dynamics to this kind of education. There's the individual and the collective. There's the science of climate change education. And there's everything under the umbrella. Look at that. There's the environmental dimension, social dimension, political dimension, economic dimension, science dimension, and so on. So there's a bit of an umbrella phenomenon when it comes to climate change education. And a climate change education should, of course, be dealing with all of these different things. But the question is how. And I really loved this little logo from a project in Zimbabwe, which is called the Zimbabwean Environmental and Climate Change Education Trust. And they, you can see, are very much involved in this little sort of earth logo here in the corner with where the little heart is. They're involved in, you can see, quite interesting things. So they're involved in agri-tech, they're involved in solar empowerment, they're involved in tree planting, wildlife management, ecotourism. And what I liked about them is that we invest in people. So they're very much people-centered and looking at people's participation in all of these different things. And they talk there about a regenerative culture. And I feel like that is the most important thing for climate change education to be doing is to be supporting a regenerative culture. In other words, to support a cultural change towards sustainability. And that will require us to be involved in all of these different things, but not get lost in the facts or in the politics or in the economics or in the social dimensions. Let's focus our energy into the area of a regenerative culture. And then I'll talk a little bit about how we can maybe frame that educationally as I move towards the end of my presentation. So there are lovely materials around that are starting to help educators to look at these different dimensions of climate change education. So here you can see one. It's from a lovely little book from Ireland, and it says knowledge and understanding of sustainable development, human rights, globalization and independence, and power and governance. Those are the things that are really important in climate change education. Then in terms of skills, creative and critical thinking, cooperation and conflict resolution, ability to manage complexity and uncertainty, and informed and reflective action. If we can manage that, we can do good climate change education. And values and attitudes, if we can show concern for the environment, commitment to sustainable development, a belief that people can bring about change, respect for people and human rights, and commitments to social justice and equity. So there's a climate change curriculum if we want to, start to look at a very basic introductory climate change curriculum. And what UNESCO are also doing is outlining learning objectives. And in their learning objectives, they cover cognitive learning objectives, socio-emotional learning objectives, and behavioral learning or action-orientated learning objectives. So they are also looking at, something more than the cognitive, more than just learning about knowledge, but also including the socio-emotional and also action dimensions in their framing of climate change education. So what good climate change education is yet to be worked out. But there's a big project going on now internationally where we're trying to look at what are the dimensions of good quality climate change education, and then how does one evaluate those in an education system. So I really loved this little diagram from the Irish book. And it was about how might climate change education look in a primary school. And if you look at the middle there, you'll see there's the learner in their classroom, in their school, in their community, and I would have added their society as well. And there's 3 little spirals that are going out. One is knowledge, one is justice, and one is action. So if you think about, okay, here's climate change education in the school, focusing around knowledge, justice, and action. Knowledge, justice, and action from learner to class, to school, to community. Then you can begin to see also a really nice framework for climate change education. And it's also about creating a culture of climate change education at class, school, and community level. So it's not just about the individual lesson or the activity or the piece of science that you're trying to transfer. It's creating a culture. So this idea of the regenerative culture coming through this multi-leveled sort of laminated system for climate change education. Learner, class, school, community, society. We can add society from where we are. And if you look at the little diagram, the logo from the Zimbabwe Environment and Climate Education Trust, they talk about we invest in people towards a regenerative culture. So I feel like that is really the heart of climate change education. And if we can look at, this sort of outline of the core knowledge, skills, values, and attitudes type of thing, and we can think about that as not as science, human agency, skills for action, skills for doing things, and then values and attitudes, the ethics of why we're doing things, then we can enrich this little model that we can see here. So the problem that we have, I think, is that we don't have a good way of explaining what climate change education is, and then people get pulled sideways. So we should do adaptation, climate change, or we should do climate change for mitigation, or we should do climate change for resilience building, or we should climate change for disaster risk reduction. And what we then end up with is we see lots of climate change education coming up in sort of patchy ways. And we've done a big review in South Africa, and we found exactly that there was a lot of patchiness. in climate change education from that perspective. Lots of people doing lots of different things, but nobody really having a very clear idea of what climate change education might look like and how we might manage to monitor and understand it better. So, and it's complicated like that. It's patchy because it involves technical changes, cultural changes, critical social processes, various forms of social learning, and ultimately all of these are necessary to build up regenerative cultures that are transformative, transgressive, and not afraid to cross boundaries, to integrate knowledge, justice, and action. So I think if we can think about climate change education, of all of these different things that everybody's doing from these different vantage points, and then bring them into this idea of social learning that builds up regenerative cultures that are transformative, transgressive, and not afraid to cross boundaries, that can integrate knowledge, justice, and action, then I think we have a stronger framework for climate change education. And this type of climate change education oriented towards a regenerative culture can challenge the existing knowledge, practice, ethics interface, and we can begin to see what kinds of adaptation, mitigation, transformation, resilience, resistance practices are feasible and necessary in any particular context, how they can be developed with people, and particularly if we take account of what people value being and doing and look towards positive actions towards sustainability with them. And so that's the kind of process of being able to produce this regenerative culture through our climate change education. And such an approach to climate change education should also move beyond awareness and to really strengthen and build practice and capability approaches that can integrate knowledge, ethics, and action. Again, just to take this discussion a bit forward, climate change education orientated towards a regenerative culture should focus on participation in communities of practice. In other words, it's not an individual thing only. It must involve more than one person, people in groups, and support the changing of activity. And if we understand activity to be a collective concept, and to change activity, one needs transformative agency in collectives, in groups of people. There's not possible for one person to introduce a whole solar energy system. It has to be done together in groups and with transformative agency spread across the social system, not just one person. Of course, that one person is important, but they need to be in collectives working with others. And climate change education that is oriented towards a regenerative culture will allow educators to work on new problems as one of the most significant learning challenges of the 21st century. And I think that's the challenge for educators, is to think about this kind of education as a learning challenge. It's a learning challenge of our century. It's a learning challenge of our times. And if we can think about education catalyzing regenerative cultures, changing our cultures away from overconsumptive cultures, cultures of inequality, cultures of exclusion, we can really begin to change the nature of education, because education is a cultural practice. And when we work in education, we're working at the front end of culture. We either reproducing culture or we can transform culture. So I think we need to think about ways that education can actually make these cultural transformations. So let's work in inter and transdisciplinary ways with disciplinary insight and depth. It's not throwing out the disciplines in favor of the inter or the transdisciplinary. It's actually mobilizing the depth of climate change science, the strength of climate change politics, the nature of climate change ethics, and bringing those together into inter and transdisciplinary ways with disciplinary insight and depth. To integrate justice principles with the highest level of scientific knowledge and the best possible development thinking and practice guided by ethics. To support learning to become part of and mobilize new practices and activity in all spheres. To develop our agency and our reflexivity so that we can make our way through the world in response to these matters of concerns and in relation to our societies and the need for societal change. So just in closing, I'm getting near to the end of my presentation. I think that we can think about climate change education. Early on in 1992, Ulrich Beck said that education and information open up new possibilities of dealing with and avoiding risks. And of course, that's what we're trying to do with climate change education, is to deal with and avoid risks. And if we were to take this idea that I've been putting forward in this paper here, is that climate change education is an ethics-led, transformative, transgressive, social learning and agency-building process that can build regenerative cultures and activity for the future, informed by but not limited to science only. Knowledge, justice, action should not be separated out in climate change education. And this could form the foundation of how we approach climate change education. And we can then apply it to adaptation, mitigation, resilience building, disaster risk, and to different disciplines and interdisciplinary contexts. So if we can get to the core of what we're wanting in climate change education, the interfacing of science, ethics, agents, and agency, building in this little sort of spiral perspective that we towards a regenerative culture, then I think we are moving somewhere with our climate change education. So just to get back to the little patchwork, this is the study that we did for the South African government, for the UNFCCC, and we found, a lot of patchiness. So there's climate change education going on everywhere. Teacher education with schools and teachers in NGOs, in TVET colleges, media practitioners, local government. In the education research sector, it's very uneven, it's quite patchy. So what do we do about that patchiness? Can we, bring a sort of fairly open process framework to bear on that as a way of perhaps helping all of these different subsectors to strengthen the climate change education that they are doing? So bring ethics to the fore, ethics and justice, bring action and agency to the fore, bring science and knowledge to the fore. And we have that sort of working in the spiral system, involving learners, classrooms, schools, communities, society, in this sort of open process type of approach. So that's what I would like to leave you with, and thank you very much for listening to the webinar. Okay, thank you.